Has anybody been hot the last two or 3 weeks? Anybody done any sweating, out looking at your crops? Well, that's the stress that the beans are under right now. Typically, soybeans like it around 86 degrees. That's their optimum temperature for growth and development, and we've been well above that for the last at least 10 days. And it looks like for the next several days, we're going to be above that. Anytime soybeans get any kind of stress, they kind of start shedding pods, start shedding blooms to try to eliminate some of that stress. And so I've had several calls the last probably the last 10 days on soybeans starting to shed pods, starting to shed blooms. Best thing we can do for that is irrigation. That's going to give us some relief from the heat, even though we're still, hovering around 100 degrees. There's a possibility you can still see some shed, but that irrigation is going to be our best method of combating the heat stress. It's going to cool that temperature inside that canopy a little bit cooler than it is at the ambient temperature because you've got some shading in there. You got the evaporation from the irrigation water, and so it's going to be a little bit cooler in there, and soybeans aren't going to be as stressed under irrigated conditions as they are under dryland conditions. On top of that, we're probably facing the worst bollworm outbreak we've ever seen in the last several years. Actually had some farmers have already had to treat twice. Some are looking at a third application of insecticide for bollworms. Where pyrethroids are still working pretty good, but where you're having to go in, especially with these hot, dry conditions, about a half a pound of acephate mixed with your pyrethroid seems like it's giving us a little bit better control. Putting it out at in the middle of the day, late in the afternoon, we're seeing some volatilization, so we're not getting as much penetration down in the canopy as we are putting it out, early in the morning or late in the afternoon. So if you are having problems with worms, we need to be out there scouting for those. Historically, Clay County has kind of bypassed some of the bollworm problems, but we were in a field day yesterday in Clay County, and they were catching, about 1,100 worms, or 1,100 moths, in their traps in about a 3-day period. So historically, they haven't had much problems with bollworms, but this year it looks like they're going to have problems. The fields we are going to probably have the most problems are the wide rows where you can still see down the rows. They haven't lapped. You can still see the soil down the rows of the soybeans. Those tend to be the ones that the moths want to concentrate to. So if you got some drill or some row beans that just haven't quite lapped, those are the ones you really need to be focusing on, and as well as some of your drill beans. But need to be out there. 9 worms per 25 sweeps, our recommendation. And once we get over that, we definitely need to be out there putting out an insecticide to control those. Are starting to pick up a few stink bugs around, especially in the southern part of the state. We've actually had, some fields that have had to be treated for stink bugs, but they tend to start building up now and through the end of the season. Right now, USDA has us predicted about 3.15 million acres of soybeans in the state. That's down a little bit from where we were last year. Most of the beans are somewhere in the flowering to podding, setting pods. We've actually had one field that was harvested about 10 days ago in southern Chico County. It was a dryland early 4 field, somewhere around the 35 to 40 bushel range. And then the first of last week, I was still receiving calls on guys wanting recommendations on seeding rates and planting recommendations, still trying to get some soybeans in the ground. So within the same week, I've heard, beans being harvested and beans being planted. So this harvest is going to be pretty much strung out. If you look at the calendar dates, those guys that are just now, planting a week ago, it's going to be at least, if conditions are right, 1st of November, middle of November, before those beans are anywhere close to being ready for harvest. So we're hoping to have a fairly mild fall. Maybe we can push that freeze date back a little bit and not have a early freeze, and prevent some of these late planted crops from getting out of the field. Disease-wise, it's just been too hot and dry. We are starting to pick up some charcoal rot, some of these stress-related diseases, especially in our dryland fields, and especially in some of our irrigated fields on the bottom ends, where either water has not gotten down to the bottom of the field, or in the bottom of the field where water has stood for several days, and then you go through a dry period, we're starting to see some charcoal rot problems in those situations. Foliar diseases are starting to pick up a little bit. It's still pretty hot and dry for foliar diseases, but we've kind of had some showers in certain parts of the state over the last several days, and so foliar diseases could, pick up and start being a problem. Soybean rust is not a concern. It's still in extreme southern Texas, at the southern Alabama and Florida, and so right now it's probably one of the furthest things on the radar that we're really worried about this year. Things could change. We could switch our environmental conditions, start getting some cloudy weather, have a hurricane blow in and blow some of those spores up from the south, but right now we're really not too concerned with it with some of the other problems we're starting to see. Bob was talking about resistant weed problems and what we can do to combat those. The biggest, or probably the most newest tool on the market is LibertyLink soybeans. Right now we're just have a limited supply of varieties. Last year we tested 8 different LibertyLink varieties in variety testing. This year we've got 13. And so we're in the process of screening those not only for yield, but also other agronomic characteristics, disease ratings, nematode ratings, salt tolerance. And so hopefully we should be able to get that information out to you as quick as possible this fall if you're interested in looking at LibertyLink varieties. As I mentioned, varieties are fairly limited right now. There are several companies that in the state that have LibertyLink varieties. They did sell out pretty much of every variety that was available last year. Early indications are they're going to have a pretty good supply of Roundup or LibertyLink varieties next year for the planting purposes. So if you weren't able to get your LibertyLink varieties this past year, you should be able to get those. But you may want to start looking into those fairly early, because again, there's going to be more than we was last year, but again, it's still going to be a limited supply, and so you may want to get your name on the books fairly early for that. But the biggest thing right now is irrigation and scouting for worms and late season insects. Most of the crop is getting to the point where the heat's really not going to affect it, but we still got probably 30 to 40% of the crop where the heat's probably going to be could have an impact if we don't break this cycle or get occasional rain or try to irrigate as quick as possible. But that's about all I've got for a quick update on soybeans. Research-wise, I don't have anything here on the station, but I've got stuff at other stations in different places around the state. We're looking at different seeding rates, row spacing research, looking at a lot of inoculant work. There's been a lot of interest in inoculant work, especially coming behind cotton production. Fields that have been historically in cotton for the last several years definitely need an inoculant, but we're also looking at different scenarios behind rice, behind soybeans, behind corn. So we got different rotations, different products, and different rates of those products, and doing several other different variety testing, seeding rate studies, as I mentioned. And then the biggest project we're probably looking at is maximizing yield, and that's kind of looking at what some of the things that Kip Color has been doing the last several years. Kip's the producer. It's got the record yield on soybean production. Talking to him this year, he's expecting to probably be a little bit better than he has on his yield he was a couple of years ago. So he's expecting to break his record yield from, I think, 2 years ago. He's expecting to break that this year. So that's going to be interesting to see. We've actually been going to his farm and doing some observations and taking data and other things like that. It's been real interesting going up there and looking at that.